everyone. Welcome along to Edie Extra at Edie24. So Edie24, of course, is the sustainability event of the year. And Edie Extra, for those who aren't aware, is going to be a new channel that we are setting up right now at Edie, basically to bring us closer to you, the audience, and touch on some of the themes that doesn't just shape business actions, but also the actions of a sustainability professional. So Edie Extra is going to be a multimedia content channel we're setting up shortly, focusing on teams, projects, initiatives and discussions to drive corporate climate action in the UK and further afield. So in that sense, Edie24 is acting as a bit of a soft launch for the Edie Extra that you can see in the background. So across the 2 days, we've got numerous discussions taking place at this stage in the breaks and with a live audience. So for those watching at home by video, there is a live audience in front of us tuning along. So thank you for those who are taking time from their coffee breaks to come and listen to this discussion. And the discussion itself is focusing on addressing the environmental impact of animal agriculture to see if a plant-based economy is the way forward. I'm Edie's editor, Matt Mace. I'll be chairing today's discussion. And with me, I have two very insightful guests in the sense that we have Hannah Cornick, who's the Head of Sustainability and Social Innovation at Danone, and Sally Smith, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Upfield. So thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
So as a starting point, I think it could be great to get just a bit of an intro about yourself, your organisations, and where this kind of aligns in the discussion that we're having today. But I want to start with the kind of opening points that the Climate Change Committee notes that there's a 20% reduction required in dairy consumption, meat consumption per capita by 2030, which I know is only a small part of animal agriculture, but it kind of sets the tone that there's a lifestyle shift required in order to reach and deliver a net zero transition. So as a starting point, as you introduce yourselves on that, my question, the opening question is, what is the role of business in raising awareness of the climate impacts of animal agriculture? So Sally, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here and thanks for the invite. So I work for a company called Upfield. We're a leader in plant-based foods. So we've got three big categories of plant-based foods: alternatives to dairy in the plant-based butters, creams and cheeses categories, so brands that you'd know in the UK like Flora, and brands like Violife on the cheese side that are there ultimately, hopefully, to be super tasty, inspiring foods that help people make those shift choices, right? And food fundamentally has to be tasty. We usually eat it 3 times a day. In order to shift that transition, we need foods that are firstly absolutely delicious and available to consumers and that delight them when they sit down and they function and you use them, and they have to be affordable for everybody. And at Upfield, that's what we're inspired by. The work that we do on food innovation is all about trying to drive the future of food into that space that allows us and allows you all and us all to make great choices and better choices when it comes to the impact of the foods that we have. So we're really interested in this question about how do we shift the food system that we've created today. 30% of climate impact comes from the food we eat, and of that 60% of it comes from animal agriculture. So how do we move the food system? And that's going to take change at both ends, all the way from what we as individuals are choosing to eat, what retailers and food service professionals are putting on menus and innovating great tasting menus to help you with, all the way back to the farmer in the field and what we're asking them to do with the land and the food that we're asking them to grow. So we've got to think about this at a systemic level.
Great, and I'll try not to be personally attacked by the idea that we only have 3 meals a day. I've been scoffing every food I can get. The kind of vegan options here, I've been every chance I can get. So definitely not 3 meals a day for me. But Hannah, I'd love to bring you in on that point as well.
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who don't know who Danone are, we are a health-focused food and drink company. So we have brands like Evian, Aptamil, Activia, Alpro, not necessarily all beginning with A, but and as well as sort of specialised medical nutrition products. And as you can see, one thing that's quite interesting is that we have that balance of both dairy-based products as well as plant-based products within our portfolio. So really trying to look at this holistically, and we do see a role for both in a healthy, sustainable diet. Yogurt, which is I guess at the real heart of Danone's heritage, is a really nutrient-dense, healthy form of animal protein. but obviously need to do a lot of work to reduce its environmental impact. And at the same time, we see a real potential to drive a new wave of growth for plant-based foods, where I feel like we've only just sort of hit the tip of the iceberg really in terms of that uptake. So that's what our strategy is really focused on, driving both of those things alongside each other so that we can have diets which are respectful of planetary boundaries. I mean, on the dairy side, we really are trying to kind of pioneer this move towards lower carbon dairy, and we see regenerative agriculture as playing a key part of that. We've set ourselves a science-based target that's in line with new flag guidance, as well as being one of the first companies to set a methane reduction target. So that's for a 30% reduction by 2030. I can see some thumbs up in the audience, which is great. And regenerative agriculture, we think, is going to be absolutely critical to achieve those. It's very much about, how do we work in harmony with nature and in partnership with farmers to tackle issues like soil health, water use, as well as reducing GHG emissions and preserving biodiversity. So that is going to be a real focus for us going forward, and we're already making some progress. But also, how do we make plant-based more mainstream? We know it's naturally lower carbon. Our LCA analysis tells us our oat plant-based drink, for example, is 3.5 times lower in carbon than milk. But actually, how do we, as you were saying, Sally, make it tasty, attractive, and accessible for people? And I think one of the things that we're seeing from our research, because we've been doing some research recently with consumers about how do we talk to them about regenerative agriculture, is they really just don't see that link at the moment between agriculture and environmental impact, particularly not carbon emissions. But we're starting to see that maybe topics like biodiversity are things that they might be able to relate to a bit more. So I think we have to think quite cleverly about how could we perhaps find ins through some of those more relatable topics that feel closer to people, and then use that to start a broader conversation about those big systems changes that we need to see.
It sounds like we've essentially got kind of the two ends of the value chain here. There's the supply chain and actually engaging with the farmers and driving change, and then there's that kind of consumer awareness to drive habits. Now I want to start on the supply chain and how you go around that engagement point and the successes you had, because this transition to a kind of sustainable, healthy planet, with agriculture being such a huge sector and part of the kind of backbone of the UK economy, it's a difficult conversation to have. So when you engage with suppliers and farmers down, is it kind of more carrot, is it more stick, is it a bit of both? How are you driving them to deliver some more sustainable practices in a way that's beneficial for them and not kind of just leaving them behind as decarbonisation takes place? Hannah, if I could come to you first.
Yeah, sure. I think that's absolutely critical. I mean, our approach is very much about how do we work collaboratively with our suppliers on this transition. I think it obviously is important that we set out very clear expectations to start off with about what contribution we need from our suppliers to help us meet our carbon targets. But actually, the message is really how can we work together to unlock the challenges? So, for example, last year we held our first supplier partner day in the UK and Ireland to really talk to our suppliers about our priorities and our goals, to hear some examples of best practice from them around things they were already doing, but also to really put on the table some of those challenges and explore together what can we do to tackle them. And I think that there are already some examples where we're seeing really good sort of cross-sector collaboration on some of these issues, not just vertically, but also horizontally across the supply chain. So a good example that we're involved in is the Sustainable Dairy Partnership, where the kind of dairy buying community have really come together to set out a sort of framework and standards to help dairy processors and producers understand our expectations, to have a kind of more consistent approach to reporting, and really kind of provide that toolkit and roadmap towards a more sustainable dairy sector. And now we've seen that about 30% of global milk volumes are covered by membership of the Sustainable Dairy Partnership, and really helping us towards our goal of getting to a 30% reduction on milk emissions. So that's a great example, but I think it also needs sort of more targeted collaboration. We do a lot of work directly with our dairy farmers, and we have regenerative agriculture projects all around the world. And one in particular that we've run in northern France has really focused also on not only how do we help farmers identify the hotspots and develop their action plans, but how can we connect them with the wider community. And we worked with a digital crowdfunding platform to also help them raise capital to invest in their projects. And the end result of that project has been a 9% reduction in carbon emissions. But I think what's been really interesting is how much it's boosted farmers' pride. And given that we know that actually the farming sector is really under pressure, we're seeing lots of people leave that industry. Actually, I think that in itself has been a really important learning for us, is actually how can we really support farmers' livelihoods at the same time as delivering those environmental benefits.
Great. And Sally, what's been your and Upfield's approach to the
Yeah,
supply chain?
so I think we have a slightly different and more nuanced, or not more nuanced, a different approach, let's say. Because we're inherently plant-based, we know that some of our legacy products, we did have a small amount of dairy left in them. So part of our challenge has been, how do we really focus on leaning into our crop supply chains? Farmers grow plants as well, let's not forget. They're doing that for us in fields across the UK, across the world, both from a smallholder value chain perspective, across cooperatives that we work with, and across more traditional farming models for crops. So there are different models depending on those supply chains about how we engage with our suppliers and farmers at the end of those value chains. And I think, like Danone, we find that it's often significantly more beneficial to have farmers talking to farmers rather than sustainability people from an office in London talking to farmers. I might come from Yorkshire, but my experience in those value chains is deeply limited. And you have to be really conscious of your own limitations on that, right? So let's talk clearly about where we can help, the role that we can play as a food business versus trying to unlock for farmers what they need. And we have a range of partnerships across our value chains to support different interventions at different levels, whether that's at landscape level or at farm level or at a supply chain and a supplier level. And I won't go into the details because I think it's also important to talk about the other part of this, about what you can do. So we're really pleased that Danone in particular, and we would encourage other food companies to do the same, has made those commitments about methane. We know methane is an absolutely fundamental impact now that unless we deal with rapidly, we're going to have a huge challenge around. And we started back in 2020 working out how to do quite technical split gas accounting within our corporate footprint to understand our own methane footprint. And whilst we didn't set a target on methane, we did set ourselves a challenge to eliminate that very small quantity of dairy that still sits in our portfolio. It was less than 1%. So it's a very small amount in ingredient terms. But at that point, it accounted for 9% of our methane footprint. So it's very significant in terms of that really impactful short-lived gas. And on a total basis for the whole portfolio, we've just been running the numbers, we've now taken out 33% of our methane since 2020. So by eliminating and shifting what we use and how we use it, we can make some of those choices. That does have implications and wider questions for what does that mean across supply chains. And I think it plays into the question about when we look at these dietary shifts, how do we help those supply chains adjust? Because ultimately, a bit like in coal and gas, there needs to be a just transition for farmers. We've got to be really conscious and clear that there needs to be those support mechanisms so that farmers can move and adapt to what they're doing. They are very resilient, very adaptable. They have to be in our food system. The shocks that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years in particular, I think have proved just how challenging the food system can be under shock and how resilient some of them can be. And this is another huge challenge when we look at the impacts on health, on climate, on nature, that we need as a system to think about those system shifts around.
It's really interesting you mentioned the kind of the health, planet, climate, nature aspect of it, because there's so many ways, and I'm probably going to, in the interest of time, this is quite a lot to get through in a 20-minute conversation. I realise it's real whistle stop in that sense. But looking at the consumer aspect, there's so many potential ways you could engage consumers on the kind of benefits of switching this way. But I think that's still a bit of a struggle area for a lot of businesses. I know some have been trialling carbon labels to various success. It's a bit of a Marmite topic. Some people kind of love carbon labelling and just the succinct messaging it plays. Other things, it just kind of dilutes messaging already. But in terms of actually engaging the consumer and the broader society in this, what are the kind of successes you guys are seeing so far? Sally, if I can start with you.
Yeah. So some of you may know we have gone down the path of carbon labels, and we're a big believer in common, consistent, information to the consumer to help nudge them in the right direction, whether that's on pack or on shelf. We need to help people make really good informed choices with consistent peer-reviewed data. And we're very supportive of the common single platforms that will enable us as organisations to orientate towards doing that. But our position on carbon labelling that we brought out in 2019, so that's 5 years ago now, calling for that. We know that progress is slow, so we didn't want to not do something. So we have found a way to generate and build good carbon labels for all of our products across all of our territories in Europe, the UK and North America in a completely systematised way. We set ourselves a big hairy goal of saying by 2025 we would have 500 million packs with carbon labels on them, and we blew through that target back in July this year, and we're on track to exceed 1 billion carbon labels on packs systemically across everything. But we know that that information is pretty intangible to people because they don't really know what that means. So through our brands and our marketing, we're exploring ways to bring that to life for people, to help land some of those messages in the digital environment with tools, with ways in which we can inspire people to think differently about it. Our recent campaigns on Flora Plant in the UK, showing that those products have a 75% lower climate impact than dairy, are just one way to try and bring to life based on best in class, PEF aligned, ISO compliant, peer reviewed data that we substantiate and we put the information on pack. Great discussion going on downstairs about greenwashing, which we watch avidly because we are a massive believer that with good guidance and great regulation, the companies that got that exceptional story to tell about products that can make a big difference really have to find a way to tell that story to help consumers shift. But not everyone cares, right? So it's got to be tasty, it's got to be affordable. Look at a product like Violife. We use the strap line, we're vegan, you don't have to be, right? We want everyone to be able to choose those products because we can't meet just a few consumers for the food system to shift. We've got to try and bring everyone with us on this.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Hannah, how is kind of Danone approaching that kind of consumer engagement aspect?
I mean, I think labelling is a really interesting part of it, something we're very actively looking at. Very much agree with Sally's points around the kind of need for consistency, the need for it to be really science-based. I think probably the area where we might differ slightly is our preference and kind of ultimately where we'd like to get to is a more holistic environmental labelling beyond just carbon. And I mean, it's just very challenging to get to, isn't it? I mean, I think we've been involved in things like the government's food data transparency partnership to look at you know, how could we get to a kind of consistent voluntary approach to environmental labelling and a kind of piloting other schemes like Foundation Earth on our products. And I think we are finding it is very complex, but I think we should still aim towards that kind of holy grail of finding something that brings together all those different environmental impacts of a product and tries to contextualize that for consumers, because I think that's what's ultimately going to be the kind of test of this is, can a consumer really use it to compare products and make a choice between a more sustainable and a less sustainable product? And if I think, you know, even about some of our plant-based products, you know, whilst they're much lower carbon than a dairy product, we know that they can have other impacts. So, you know, for example, we're doing lots of work with our almond sourcing to reduce the water consumption of that, and you know, sourcing from the Mediterranean where it's 8 times lower water usage than, for example, in California. But how do we bring that to life for a consumer so they can compare kind of like for like rather than just, you know, between different product categories? So it's definitely really challenging, and I don't think we've cracked it by any means. So I really
don't think anyone has.
I mean, I really applaud Upfield on having got to the stage of being able to roll it out at such scale, and I think that's what's going to be really critical. We need it to be scalable so that, you know, not just big businesses like ourselves can get involved with these sorts of schemes, but small businesses as well. And that's, I think, where we'll really see the shifts in consumer behaviour, but also start to send the right incentives to the supply chain as well.
And I'm conscious we are kind of pretty much out of time, but I do have one more question.
Yeah.
So a very brief answer for both. Because we at Edie, we are seeing some examples of retailers really trying to step into this kind of plant-based space, and then maybe stepping a bit too eagerly and having to step back. So a couple of examples we've seen obviously was Pret has started to close its remaining vegetarian-only stores due to kind of decline in footfall and demand there. And it's kind of all well-intentioned progress. And there's as we learned from the mess up like last night, there's no such thing as failure. It's just another lesson on the road. But as businesses who are kind of certainly right now perhaps struggling with this short-term mindset economically, how do you strike the balance between shifting consumer habits and supply chain habits whilst kind of keeping that kind of the business commercial mindset going? What's the balance you can strike? A big question, bullet point answers, please. That's okay. So Hannah, can we go with you first?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, I think it's very much about meeting consumers where they are and then trying to kind of nudge them, help them make small practical changes to kind of ultimately where we need to get to in terms of healthy, sustainable diets. And I think keeping it positive, I think Sally talked earlier on, really heroing taste, making these products accessible, attractive. And I think what we've learned is that as much as possible, if we can link the benefits that sustainable products have for the planet to also personal benefits, so for example health, that's where we really start to engage consumers. And I think that's something we've really done a lot through our Outpro brand, and where we've been really looking at how can we make plant-based products mainstream, is actually kind of celebrate the taste of them, and I think that's what's going to really excite people about the kind of potential rather than it feeling limiting.
Great. And Sally?
Yeah, I think I would agree and then add, I think there is a piece that we also need to think about in this space around, yes, taste, but also affordability. And we know that we want to provide, as a food company, great products first and foremost, but we want to accelerate that transition. We really, really want to inspire people to eat more plant-based products more of the time, shift that balance, tip it in the right direction. And what we see is multiple interventions happening across the place, which is super exciting. So whether that's the work that retailers are doing around this, food service professionals through menus, great work coming through universities and city movements, you're now seeing countries committing, plant-based commitments around the amount of proteins in portfolios coming through in the retail space. So the amount of conversation across value chains is really inspiring. The other piece that I think we are really interested in is making sure that in that wider system the financial incentives stack up across the totality of it, because we know subsidies, taxation, the rules around labelling all stack in the existing food system, and we need to think how we utilise those mechanisms to incentivise what we need as an outcome, whether that's for the planet, for people, for health, for nature. We need to think about it, as I say, across the whole of the system and use all of those levers at our disposal.
Great. Well, I'm slightly concerned that Tannoy is going to go off and start to call people through to the other sessions now, but it's amazing what you can get through in 20 minutes on such a kind of I suppose it's a meaty subject, which is quite ironic in that sense. But we are fresh out on time on the ED Extra stage, but I would like to extend a big thank you to both Hannah and Sally for their insight today, and obviously for the audience for tuning in and listening to that discussion. The editorial team will be back in the lunch break, and then again in the afternoon break for the last 2 ED Extra sessions, and these are being recorded. There'll be videos and audio available to listen back to, so be sure to look out on the ED website for that. And as mentioned, check out the website for our new ED Extra channel page when that launches. That's our new multimedia format page, separate from our podcast, which is going to host all these kind of 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 interviews that we're hosting with sustainability professionals. So you can check that soon on iTunes, Spotify, Apple and SoundCloud as well. But until next time, thank you and goodbye.